All right. Good morning and welcome to the first panel of the day. The title of this panel is AI and Character. Just because we were already talking about kind of the ambiguity of that, we're going to start getting into it and see what that means. My name is Brian Green. I'm the Director of Technology Ethics here at the Markkula Center. And I also teach in the Graduate School of Engineering. I teach a class on AI ethics here. I'm very happy to moderate this panel because we're going to start getting into the weeds of the relationship between AI and character. And once again, even the word character has a lot of different connotations to it. We've got about, 70 minutes to work with. So, and if you have questions, by all means, write them on the cards. We will be collecting those. But we're going to start off just with a few introductions. So I'll just introduce everyone briefly, and then I'm going to give you a little bit more time to say a little bit more about yourself. So we have Kurt Bresniker, who is the Chief Architect at Hewlett Packard Labs. We have John Sullins, who is Professor of Philosopher at Sonoma State University. We have Claudia Passos Ferreira, who is a Professor of Bioethics at NYU. And we have Christopher Quintana, who is joining us via Zoom. Once again, he had a close exposure to COVID, so he's just out of an abundance of caution joining us on Zoom today. And Christopher is a PhD student in philosophy at Villanova. So why don't we just go down the row and then, excuse me, if each of you can say a couple, a minute or so about yourself.
Kurt Bresniker, Hewlett Packard Labs Chief Architect. I'm also a fellow and Vice President of Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Along with all of the day job, I actually have the last 2 years have been leading our APE working group that has drafted our global AI ethics guidelines and principles. And now we're taking the even more challenging set of learning how to live out those principles in our actions across our products, across our partnerships, and across those processes that we are incorporating into our business. And it's more than just understanding how we inform 60,000 employees in over 100 countries around the world about how they should be thinking about the new technologies. At Labs, we have our AI ethics research team. And what that team has taken on is, as we understand, principles of AI ethics that are authentic to Hewlett Packard Enterprise, we are finding when a product or a process or a partnership fails to meet our level of confidence we need to pursue an opportunity ethically. And often that's not just a case of diligence or observance, it's a technology gap. And so for us at Labs, our exploration into AI ethics is forming our AI development research agenda. So our agenda at Labs on AI is about trustworthy AI, and in an encompassing way that is not just about an algorithm or an approach. It's understanding holistically from the sensors and the methodologies that gather the data, how we create provable provenance, how we create measurable confidence in AI models and their outcomes.
Thank you. I should just add that Kirk is also an alum of Santa Clara from our engineering school.
Excellent.
John.
Hi, I'm John Sullins. I'm the program director at the Center for Ethics, Law, and Society up in Sonoma, just north of the Bay Area here. I began my path into technology ethics when I was a young researcher at Xerox Palo Alto Research Laboratory, and there they were inventing the future, and I was confronted with many different ethical challenges, and I was hired there as a philosopher, not in spite of being a philosopher, and I was allowed to get my fingers into lots of different projects and see what people thought and how engineers thought and how the corporation deals with the challenges of various technologies. And from there, I've gone on to teach, and I have spent a lot of time teaching future technologists and future ethicists. And the SITE program that we just ended was the culmination of decades worth of work from Shannon and I on trying to build a a hothouse program where we can get people that just really can consolidate their skills and make connections into the wider world and change what's happening with our technologies.
So, hi, I'm Claudia Passos, and I'm assistant professor at the Center for Bioethics at New York University. So I started my interest in ethics and technology through bioethics and biotechnology. And I gradually started moving a little bit more in the direction of artificial minds and artificial intelligence. So I designed a course on ethics and technology that mostly I teach ethics of AI at the Center for Bioethics. And I'm currently have a research project that is funded by Untitled Chapter Foundation. And the project is asking the question, what theories of consciousness can predict about consciousness in infants and in machines? So I'm highly interested in what kind of minds artificial intelligence might have now and in the future.
All right, and Christopher.
Great, thank you. I'm Christopher Quintana. I'm a PhD candidate at Villanova University. I've long had interests in virtue ethics and applied virtue ethics. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've shifted into looking at tech ethics in particular, mostly into design ethics. I'm deeply interested in sort of the design of digital ecosystems, which maybe we'll talk a little more about. And you know, I teach this stuff, and it really resonates with a lot of my students. So it seemed like an important path to continue on.
Thank you, Christopher. And your audio is really good. So
lovely.
I know.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but you know, I have to loom over you instead.
You're great at being the looming person over us. So good job. Why don't we just dive into our first question, and I'll just switch up who goes first. So let's start with John, and then we'll move on in kind of the same rotation that we went in before. But John, would you say a little bit about how you would describe the character or nature of AI? In other words, what is AI, especially in relation to moral behavior? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on with the IEEE on standards for AI nudging, and that work has taught me that I believe AI has a tremendous role to play in character, possibly a very corrosive role to play in character. We've seen that internet technologies already, just nascent recommender systems and things like that, will pull you down the deepest, darkest rabbit hole that you never even imagined that you were capable of. Doom scrolling, various habits that the technology forces us into or allows us to express ourselves through, and that has gotten me worried in that the next suite of technologies where the system is able to like we saw with GPT-3 sort of convincingly give you stories and spit back to you things that you want to hear. That I believe is going to be possibly corrosive in your own character as you interact with these technologies. So the character of AI itself, it doesn't have any because it's not a person. It's not conscious. It's not. It doesn't need a lawyer to be saved from Google, and but it's going to act as if it is, and that I think is going to be rather influential in our behavior. Now, the possible good news is that as we're going to discover in this panel, virtue ethics is one in which you have to have an exemplar, what's called in classical virtue ethics a phronemon, and it's possible that we could, if we set our minds to it, instead of setting our minds to dragging ourselves to our lowest common denominator, we could use the exact same technology to make our character better. And it might be a little less profitable, but it certainly will be a lot better for the planet. So my particular work, I'm interested in developing this thing I call artificial phronesis, which is how do we if technology like AI is good at reflecting who we are, can we get it to reflect our best nature, the best of us, and then have that pull the rest of us up from the bottom? I'll have more to say, but I'll pass it on.
Yeah, so my way to reply to this question is, I think in similar lines as John. So it's okay. So I'll get the John suggests two ways to get this question. I also get this question more how to describe the nature of AI. So I would say that it's hard to define the nature because it depends on the type of systems that you will design. So for instance, you have a system that's playing games or systems for social interaction or social media, social robots. Those systems will have different, if you can say different nature, different characters. Even if you can maybe find or abstract some universals, it might be hard to point a universal character of. And if you think about a system like GPT-3, GPT-3 can adopt different characters. It can take of many personas. You can have a conversation with different characters there. And I think the question is if you can really talk about genuine character or genuine moral character in AI systems without consciousness or self-awareness or without some kind of general intelligence. And I would have some similar lines as John. I would be a little bit skeptical to talk about genuine character in those systems if you don't have at least a more complex kind of mind. And probably would need some kind of self-awareness or consciousness to have a real character. Maybe what we can have is behaviors that emulate or simulate similar characters. But I think if you think about moral character, then I really think we need consciousness into the picture, because it might be very hard to have a system that you can attribute intentions to do bad or good actions if the system cannot have or interpret or have any meaning related to the intentions they have when they are acting. So if you have to say if the AI is evil or good, I think you have to reflect about what kind of meaning AI might be able to attribute to their own actions. So this is.
Thank you. Christopher.
Great, thanks. I guess I'll say I'm in deep agreement with a lot of what John was mentioning with the sort of virtue ethical concerns. Something I've been looking at, though, in my work is trying to think about the character of AI on similar lines of the nature of it, but the nature of where it tends to be and where we tend to encounter it and interact with it. And in particular here, I'm thinking of recommender systems. So what I'm kind of interested in examining is that these recommender systems, we encounter them in a particular digital ecosystem. I'm thinking here of within particular interfaces, within particular experiences that are curated, designed, tested. And so for me, one thing I'm deeply interested in looking at is what's the nature of the design environment that allows the recommender system to thrive, that allows it to form, I think, a pretty important part, for better and for worse, of a lot of our technological use. And in examining the nature of that environment that it finds itself in, so somewhat shifting the question a little bit.
Thank you. Kurt.
John, something you said there, it really struck me. You're saying, the systems force you into doom scrolling. They don't. They were designed to do that. And there's an intentionality. So when we're using these tools in any technology that is sufficiently merits investment, is going to be dangerous. We go back to the 5 simple machines, and we can see that ability to magnify force is that first dangerous machine. But when I think of character, I think of character formation, and we've already said this. These are incredibly evocative tools. When we think of these AI-driven experiences, we think of, they're enthralling, they're captivating. Well, a thrall or a captive, or they're addicting, an addict. All of those are designed. So that is something that is inherent about this technology, especially when coupled with the ability to extract from us even subconscious behaviors and tics and tells. When that is amassed and then coupled with this technology, we suddenly have the ability to influence across the entire population, but down to your individual preferences. We don't have to be able to craft our own Pygmalion anymore. Someone is going to do it, and we will be helpless but to respond, because it's exactly what we desire. And so you look at something like that and you can say, wouldn't it be great if we think of early childhood development and those first, 2 dozen months, how important it is to stimulate the child. And wouldn't it be wonderful that regardless of how tired or overworked or sick or overburdened the parent was, there was always someone there to sing a song, to have an experience. And at the same time, there's probably something there's nothing more frightening than imagining a for-profit or a company is the one who's whispering in that newborn's ear. So these tools are incredibly powerful to help us shape these behaviors, but they are that underlying tool. So for me, it's not the character of AI. It is the character of the individuals who design and employ this incredibly sharp scalpel for discerning and cutting away. It could be for cutting away the most abusive and negative parts of our behavior, or it could be cutting us away from any moral understanding or anchor that we have.
Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts on that first question?
Yeah, I would, if we can extend on those ideas, I think what Kirk is saying is absolutely vital. And so my question, I guess, would be to the panel: how do we develop character in the designers and implementers of this technology, given the fact that they can often have some perverse motivations to do exactly the opposite? This was one of the things that immediately struck me when in the 90s when I was at Park, is that there's super powerful stuff. But there's always this pressure from outside, like the big corporation, like how are we going to turn this into something that makes money? And that is always the motivation at the bottom. And so I can see that if I had the ability, and we do, to develop a piece of technology that would be so enthralling that I'm on it all the time, that's a lot of engagement, a lot of ad revenue that I'm developing, and a lot of profit. If I'm developing a piece of technology that's trying to make me a better person, it's going to possibly cause me to put the machine down and be a better person.
Other thoughts from the panel on that?
Yeah, I get a little bit confused of the question. So the question now is
just kind of following on. So John was saying, how do we get the designers to actually become better people? Ultimately,
don't be skeptical to, at least in the current state that AI has a moral character. I think they can impact a lot and shape a lot of our moral self. So I think there is a concern that I agree. I don't know if it's a danger, but at least a concern that AI can impact a lot the users and build or create new habits, modify previous habits, and prevent other habits that maybe would like to stimulate to be developed. So the question is how we can. So maybe. What kind of maybe virtues we would like that the developers have to at least to build AIs that will help human flourishing. So I think that there are many virtues that are relevant in this sense. Humility, generosity, responsibility, accountability. But I would like to emphasize one virtue that I think is empathy that might be relevant. So not just the capacity to resonate with feelings, but also the capacity to imagine how the technology can impact users and be able to take the perspective of the users and be able to anticipate some risks and some dangers that the technology might have to us. So if I would like to think about what kind of things a developer might have, I would like to emphasize the empathic abilities that might help them to design, better, if they have the intention to build a machine that will prevent some risks. I think this would be a kind of ability.
I'd like to pick up on that theme, and I think of personally. I think of when I was here 33 years ago, and I was one of, I think, 2 or 3 engineering students who were in the honors program too. And so we had our ethics seminar, and actually Professor Lucas, who was head of the philosophy department at the time, he was our instructor. And it just so happened that year, the theme was technology ethics, was perfect for me. We even watched great science fiction films. We watched The Thing from Another World and Them, which places the scientists and the military on opposite sides of who was being virtuous at any one time. So you could see that ebb and flow through the 50s and the 60s in the U.S. Cinema. But as we were having those conversations, I think there is a piece of what I learned here, not only when I was on this side of the campus attending the ethics seminars, but when I was on the other side of the campus, especially in the civil engineers, the mechanical engineers, even like I was an electrical engineer, there was a sense of, and instilled upon us, of the impact of our engineering decisions, and it kind of what the civil engineers were the most, because they were designing bridges and buildings. Mechanical engineers, especially like my father, was a professional engineer, and they took a test, they were certified. Even the electrical engineers, we were dealing with dangerous things in our lab. We could hurt each other or our fellow students if we weren't careful, and so that was instilled. I think there's a piece of the software design, software engineering, so much about this because it's just bytes, because it's just programming. There may not be that same history. Yeah. I was taught hazards-based safety engineering. When I got to HP, one of the first things I learned is every tool you use to assemble or service a product, you have to imagine that a technician accidentally drops that screwdriver when the equipment is open. Can that particular screwdriver fall in short, cause a fire, and hurt someone? Hazards-based safety engineering, which is, I think, Connie, what you're talking about. Are we teaching engineering students to think about the repercussions, the bad actors who might use it, the misusers, and are they looking to actively mitigate? Are they looking to perhaps even not approach a problem because they cannot think of a way to mitigate? And I think there's an element that could be incorporated more broadly in the engineering disciplines, especially those that are all about software code algorithms, where perhaps if they had more exposure to what we did because we were doing things that could hurt us on a daily basis, we were inculcated into that process very early.
I wanted to say something here. Claudia mentioned empathy as a sort of important virtue, and I think that's right, but I think something I wanted to identify is that maybe this is less the case within engineering, but thinking about interface designers and experience designers, empathy is a pretty important part of their practice, at least so far as I understand it. And if I'm right to say that algorithms are dependent on these really attractive interfaces, these attractive experiences, and it seems like those folks are also part of this design process. And perhaps maybe a more expansive notion of empathy would be important. But I think there's already some currents within human-centered design or user-centered design that is tending toward this direction. And perhaps it's a matter of how can we get the impulses like those within technological development that we already have and put those in conversation at the handoff point or whatever other point with the engineers who then have to build and integrate this stuff. So I guess I want to say that we're not lacking in resources or pathways to potentially think about constructing more ethical technologies. And I think in particular, those who have empathy and are deeply concerned with the users themselves are one of the possible routes. Maybe one last thing. One of the folks here at site, Lonnie Watson, she's a virtue theorist, and she works a lot on inquisitiveness is one of the virtues that she really writes a good bit about. And it strikes me that that's an important virtue to try to cultivate within these folks. And I suppose if you're here and you're a technological developer, congratulations, you're sort of moving toward that. But it strikes me that it needs to be an awareness that it's not just an engineering problem, and these things are going to go way beyond that domain.
Thank you. This has been really interesting so far because these questions, the first question about the character and nature of AI is very abstract. So it's been interesting to see, let's go down into very specific examples. So for example, what about the virtue of generosity, or what about the virtue of empathy? And how does GPT-3, a very particular AI system, relate to those? Or how does the user interface in particular relate to those virtues? So I think that one of the things that we can perhaps benefit from is to get away from the very grand abstractions and to start getting down into very specific systems. And I think that's where things can start getting clarified. I want to move on to the next question and just open it up to anybody who wants to go first. What role does AI have in shaping or impacting human character? We've already talked a little bit about that, but let's just talk some more. Anybody?
So I'll start. I just think, being able to craft and, to the point here about user experience, I think absolutely, but, that ability to empathize has been weaponized as well. Right. The ability to craft either an interface that just cannot be put down. That is an incredibly powerful tool, but it could also be used for very negative purposes. In the same way, there's also, you can also do the dark design. You can create user interfaces which while they meet some letter of the law in consumer confidence and in respect for the consumer, they can also put you through a nightmare trying to unsubscribe to a service. And it is everything about understanding how we desire to interact with systems and then doing the opposite. So I think all of those things are there. But Brad, your point of crafting these, it is, this ability to design and to customize. And I would hope, when I think again of tools and toys, it would be wonderful if individuals could be able to utilize these tools, things like GPT-3, not only to reproduce some mass amalgam of whatever the trainer has pushed through, but to recapture language and culture and be able to transmit that on. Wouldn't it be great if there were more speakers of a language that might be lost? Yeah. And not only to capture, and now especially not just the text, but the nuance, the voice, the images. I mean, think of DALL-E and all these abilities to craft really evocative images that are germane to a specific culture or group and enable them to continue to allow those to be passed on. Again, that there is this tireless advocate for your culture that is native to you and your community. That could be incredibly powerful, but it could also open up for appropriation and then also homogenization. That there's just some one bland culture that is determined to be maximally efficient in consumption, and that is what we all end up being provided through these incredibly evocative tools.
Yeah, and to add to that train of thought, I also want to bring into the fact that that this culture that we're part of is not the only culture constructing AI, and that there's a whole bunch of people who are not at this table who are creating AI that is going to impact our culture in the world with their own set of ideas on what is character, what is virtue, what is viewpoints of how the world should be, and I think we're going to be in this really interesting period of massive multicultural amalgamation that's going to be brought to us by AI, and that's going to really change what's possible as humans and what's impossible to do as humans.
Yeah, I think I mentioned already. I think that AI will have like a huge, or at least is already having a huge impact and shaping our character. If you see the way we interact with those systems, just to give an example, we didn't think in the beginning that we will become so connected to our iPhones, and you can literally say that our iPhones now is our type of extended mind. So we rely on our iPhone for many things. And if you go ahead with some proposals that maybe we can use AI to make more decisions for us, so this will really impact a lot our moral character. Imagine if we rely on an app on our iPhone to make decisions, if some action is the right action or the correct actions to make in certain circumstances. So it means we will delegate to the system some ethical decisions that usually you think that the individual responsible for this. So this can create, I think, bad as all technology, bad and good things, wonderful and horrible things. I think it's be aware of the potential dangers and be aware of the goods or the benefits this technology can bring us is relevant. One way I think that there is just to get some example, how we change a lot the way we interact in social media, given the way the algorithms behave. So we now make judgments very fast. We reply very fast. We judge people very fast. We create some tension that we might not create in real life. So just to give one example that might affect our character, because if you develop this kind of relationship and this relationship becomes a habit, that you just make judgments without any kind of reflection, this will impact a lot the way we interact with people.
I think one point I think it's an overarching one, but it seems like a major concern here is sort of the nature of habituation. And of course, for the virtue ethicists in the room, we all know sort of habituation is the way to glory, so to speak, but at the same time, it's the way to vice. And I think too, in particular, what I'm thinking is a sort of habituation of our expectations and of how easy it might be to consume quote unquote content, what is the nature of even something like aesthetic consumption when so much of it is tailored through or filtered through recommender systems. And I think too, the feeling of, well, how much do I really have to work to find something that I find engaging or interesting or intellectually stimulating? I'm not of the time where I had to really maybe dig through a library, so I'm not trying to be that sort of romantic. I do see the benefits of being able to just digitally consume plenty of content, but I do think there's a worry about how easy is it going to be to access the kinds of goods that I'm pursuing online, and is that in tension with the fact that so many of the goods that we tend to pursue are not all that easy and actually take a significant amount of friction, pain, failure at times to move towards. So that's sort of one thing that I worry about. What happens to human character is the habituation of expectation of things being easy and ready at hand and achievable with very little friction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we start becoming so accustomed to interacting with technological systems and assuming that it's just going to be easy. And then when we're dealing with another human being or something that's not one of these systems designed to be easy for us, then it's just frustrating, right? And we get driven back into that easy world and away from the real world, which is more difficult. I think I've seen that happening, you know, even in various places. So I want to kind of move on to the next question. And the next question talks about the virtues of those who create and kind of control AI. And it also relates to one of the questions that we got from the audience. Is not the character of AI really determined by the creators and their that obvious profit motive? And what do you do? I mean, that profit motive is obviously connected to the vice of greed in many ways. So how can we really talk about AI as something that is potentially just like at its core infected by that vice?
I'm going to jump in quickly, maybe to pluck prudence very quickly and take it from the pool. I think something that became clear to me throughout the time at site and talking to folks within the industry is a sort of deep concern inevitably with profit motive, but also with speed and trying to get products out quickly and be first to market or produce a new feature before somebody else does. That's something that I think maybe the philosophers, I think we obviously think about that, but trying to really incorporate that into the puzzle as a very serious issue. And what comes to mind is, I take the point from the panel that, yes, design can be used in these nefarious ways. We know dark patterns are a very serious problem. They have been exploited and continue to be exploited pretty regularly. But my sense is that those folks have to put what might be a genuine concern and empathy for the user. They have to figure out how to pitch and how to convince other stakeholders that this is something that needs to be taken seriously and designed into the product itself. And so to do that, it strikes me that you need this practical rationality that can look at an issue from how are they going to approach this? How can I best frame what we're doing in something like ethical design or human-centered design in a way that is translatable to these other goods. I suspect that there'll be moments where they're in tension, but hopefully those folks are equipped with the capacity to convince the other stakeholders involved that it ought to be pursued.
Sure. So I think, and this is probably disingenuous being an engineer myself, but there's a piece of this that I think there are the teams who design and craft these technologies, and I know, and I have been guilty of this myself. I am only designing a server. I am only designing this or that, this piece of it, and if you aren't given that larger understanding of how this tool will be used, then I think you can just put the blinders on and say, I don't design the front end of the rocket, I only design the engine. And what's at the other end is someone else's moral hazard. But I think there's a piece of that says, no, you have to be more cognizant of that. And for me, when I think of the profit motive, I don't necessarily think of the engineering teams who are designing the technology. I'm thinking of the teams that are funding the build out of the entire infrastructure. And that is what is being pursued for profit. So it is the utilization of the tool for profit. And I know for us, as I said, helping design our AI ethics principles, the thing that was useful for me is that when we started out with that blank sheet, the first thing I could write at the top of the sheet was, we have a purpose at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. If you spend more than a couple minutes with our CEO, he will remind you our purpose is to advance the way people live and work by maximizing the potential of their potential. And so at least I had that to hang our hat on. And yes, we are a for-profit company. We are governed by incorporated in the state of Delaware. So we have all of the encumbrance of a for-profit corporation. But at least I have a leadership team who will remind us all of that purpose just about every chance they get. And so that was something for us to then enter into a broader conversation. And I know not everyone has that capability of operating on even if you're a for-profit company that has that kind of expression of purpose that is regularly held accountable to. So that perhaps is, I hate to use the word luxury, but that's part of my decision and why I went from here 33 years ago to there, and I never left. So that's a piece of this is to have that understanding of how and why these technologies are being marshaled for purpose and the investments that are made. And I guess for me, yes, we won't cure that ill, but I guess we could look at the profit motive and how it drives what we seem to be disruptive, non-human centric behavior. But I could look at totalitarian regimes who are also marshaling these technologies and investing as much and building out, and perhaps they even have an advantage in that they can demand more information from their populations at every turn. So there are lots of bad motivations to use technology that is incredibly effective, and whether that is for human good or not is up to who is employing it.
Claudia or John?
Yeah, I can just mention very briefly. So I think it's true that we would like those that control AI to cultivate better, so at least virtues and not just vices. So maybe accountability and responsibility might be a good way to deal with some of those vices. But I don't know, I'm a little bit skeptical if just cultivating virtues would be enough to deal with some of those vices. I think you might need a regulatory system, some framework that regulate the way the systems are designed and the way they are deployed in society to avoid perpetuating those vices. So I don't know, Aaron Winfield was mentioned yesterday, kind of IRB for designers, and I think would be a good strategy, a series of rules and principles that might avoid them to perpetuate some vices and to move in a more virtual perspective in the way they design the system.
Yeah, I'd add on to that I've been involved with a number of different initiatives through the IEEE, and for those who don't know what that is, it's a large international engineering organization that is composed of engineers not necessarily aligned with any particular corporation or country or government or anything. And so we've been working in that. It's a large group of people that's been working for almost 10 years now on developing first a set of ethical guidelines for called, the name is escaping me now, ethically aligned design. And so you can take a look at that document. And then now they've been taking those and bringing them into ethical standards. So there's if you're familiar as an engineer, you'll know that there's standards for literally everything. But these are the first set of standards that I think are discussing best practices for making ethical decisions in very specific ways with technologies. Now, one of the things that I want to get us to talk about here is that, as Kirk was saying, probably a lot of the main problems don't really exist with corporations that, these big, powerful corporations that have the time to be a little more introspective about what they're doing and have a long tradition of doing so. The real issue is when we're developing these standards, we've had people that come in and say, well, I'm from this tiny little company, right? And we're really afraid of your standard because your standard's going to add a bunch of requirements onto my design process. So if you say you have to meet these standards in order to be on the App Store, we won't be able to compete anymore, and we will fall out of the market. So adding these regulations are seen, on one hand, they're incredibly necessary, but on another hand, they are solidifying power with larger corporations and tamping down innovators in their garage. And I'm worried about that.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much to think about. We also got so many questions coming in that I want to make sure that we have time to talk about those too. So I'm just going to move on to our fourth and last question and let you all, we've already started getting into this question, which is what kind of virtues or vices might be evoked or cultivated in those who are influenced by AI tools increasingly being deployed in our society. Is that cultivation intentional or not? And of course, we already talked about, Kirk, you were saying some words like enthralled, captivated, addicted, because they want to turn us into thralls and captives and addicts. So there's some sort of an intention there, but certainly there's some probably unintentional effects going on as well. So just what are your thoughts on those sorts of things? What is AI really doing to us as a society and us as individuals?
I'll come in here. So one thing I've been thinking about in my work is it's a bit of a clunky term that gets deployed in Aristotle, and a few virtue ethicists still use it, is akrasia. And try to put that bluntly, it's when you see the good but you do the worse. And it sort of characterizes this, it's somewhat like a cognitive dissonance. I don't want to be too quick about that connection, but you're a sort of blunt and simple example. You're on a particular app. You know that when you spend X amount of time on this profile or this app for long enough, you know it makes you feel worse. You know that you tend to come out of there feeling cynical or angry or irate, and yet you still find yourself engaging in that process of scrolling or responding to others. I think part of what I have in mind here is anybody who's ever gotten an online fight on Twitter or otherwise knows that later on they probably regret it and don't really see much that was gained from that conversation. And so what I'm concerned about is it's not really a vice. Aristotle characterizes it as sort of like a sub-vice. But you have users who are using a product and on the one hand feel the sort of immense joys and see maybe it's sort of the positive way of engaging with that product, and at the same time sort of find themselves in the mud sometimes and wondering if they're not better off doing something else entirely. So I'm really concerned about this acratic state that people end up in of seeing the good and what they could do and opting to do the worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really key, Christopher. Why is it that we do that? That's what got me really interested in moving into this world of trying to discover what AI nudging is, because it seems to be a way that technologies can get to know you so well and give you just exactly the right stimulus so that you'll do things that seem to be your choice, but nonetheless you absolutely regret, like, why am I buying this thing, right? How come this thing wound up in my house? And at the time you're falling prey to a form of advertising that is so subtle, it's not in your face. Old-fashioned advertising you could kind of avoid with critical thinking and other skills that you learn to be a better person. But this stuff is so subtle and so just nudging you in tiny little ways all throughout the day to cause you to do things that you would not have done otherwise on better reflection. And I think we could wind up in a world in which that is a very common experience for all of us. I would hope that we can avoid that.
I just want to mention that the unintentional part, maybe some of those vices are unintentional. If you get maybe the GPT-3, the language models. So they can, so the GPT-3 can impersonate some conversation. So you can use this to reproduce a conversation, as a guy did recently, get all the past information on digital information from his girlfriend and reproduce a conversation with a girlfriend that is not anymore there. So you can have this moment of retrace your reproduce some kind of experience you have in the past. But at the same time, you can use GPT-3 to imitate many kinds of text. So you can cultivate laziness and lack of creativity in the students, for instance. I don't think this was intentional. I think it was a side effect of technology that it was completely unintentional and can have a bad effect because it can really favor imitation and plagiarism in our interaction, and we care about authenticity and our capacity to think about ourselves. But I think this could be a use of the technology that come with these vices that I don't know how to avoid. Should we prevent everyone to use those language models? Might not be the best way. Is there a way to design the model in a way that the model doesn't give us this incentive to reproduce this kind of plagiarism? And I don't know. So just to get one very innocent feature of a machine that was designed in a way that probably didn't have this kind of vice in mind, but it favors this kind of attitude with the machine.
Yeah, I haven't had the experience yet, but I'm bracing for the day when my students start turning in GPT-3 research papers. And how am I going to tell? It's going to be this Turing test problem.
Yeah, and if our colleagues start sending peer-reviewed papers.
Exactly, right. Maybe I can just set up a robot to do my job. That would be great.
We were having a conversation. A couple weeks ago, we had the Global Technology Governance Retreat, the World Economic Forum at the Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution up in Presidio. They love long names at the web.
Was that developed by GPT-3?
But the funny thing was, we were having a conversation, and it was like, well, you're telling this person to go in this particular pursuit. Are they going to be the next, truck driver, or the next, and they were just naming off the first thing that came to their minds about the next job to be automated. Mm-hmm. And they go, oh, how about an ethicist or an engineer? Right. Because no one is immune, right? So these technologies are going to be of importance. But, back to the topic, when I think of the utilization of technology, communication technologies in the public good, unfortunately, what I think of is the public service announcement and the after-school special, which are incredibly for those who are not old enough to remember, incredibly ham-fisted, over-the-top, completely out of tune, off-key attempts to utilize communication technologies to evoke a positive response. I guess for me, the potential here is that these are incredibly powerful and evocative tools. And for a community that decides together those behaviors that they want to incent, then this is that ability to tailor in. And I think for me, it is both the data, but then in things like GPT-3, that ability to craft a conversation, a dialogue, a story that will actually be effective, as opposed to what we've always seen pop up at 2 a.m., when they have to show the PSA or, the over-the-top message, unfortunately now it's also not just in the after-school special, it's in the toy tie-in cartoons you're seeing on YouTube. Those attempts to get children to do the right thing, and everyone's turned off by it. This could actually be a way in which that actually comes across as authentic, as representing a community, if, though, that only works if the community has access to the technology. To Claudia, to your point, can we make these tools available? Actually, if you do make them available and you enable communities to utilize these tools, then they can put forward these values, and they won't necessarily only be driven by a profit motive company who, the fiduciaries on the board of directors have a legal responsibility to maximize shareholder returns.
Yeah.
They have no responsibility. Those going to hold them accountable other in a direct way for contributing to the public good. As long as they're not getting too many lawsuits, and then that's all good. But by enabling communities to access these tools and then put their values forward, I think that could be a positive way in which this is enabled. But that costs money. Training one of these language models is megawatts and megawatts of energy, and it is millions and millions of dollars of infrastructure. And the question is, where does that come from? Perhaps, that could be something that could be funded by the companies that are utilizing this for commercial purposes.
Yeah.
All right, we have reached the part where we start asking questions, and we have two questions from the audience that are very similar to each other, so I'm going to go with that one first. Artificial phronesis, this captured a couple people's attention out there. It seems that there's a huge difference between, for example, an individual having this type of good judgment, the government trying to improve human behavior. So can we comment on that? And then also, and then kind of the question of whose values are involved in this artificial phronesis.
Yeah, so those are both really important questions. And I guess what we have to distinguish between two factors about AI ethics. There's the ethics of using AI, in which case we've just been talking about the development of the phronesis of the designers and the developers and the shareholders and the users. That's one aspect of the phronesis of dealing with artificiality, artificial intelligence in our society. So that's an individual thing, and I don't think it offends much at all of standard virtue ethics theory. It just is a different way to apply it and a different problem to apply it to. So that's going to, of course, virtues are going to be dictated by the various cultures of the individuals that are involved in these design and use and deployment of AI. So that's one question. But then there's the other question, and that is the machine itself making ethical decisions, which is necessary. Maybe it's not something that you can take a couple of different positions on it. You may draw a line in the sand and say these are the kind of decisions that machines shouldn't make. But there's nothing in principle that wouldn't allow them to at least attempt to make those decisions. We saw yesterday Alan's paper on developing a robot that makes rudimentary ethical decisions. So you can do this. It's not impossible. The artificial phronesis argument is, well, if we are going to do that, we should definitely try to create machines that are capable of making deeper, more well-reasoned, more virtuous decisions. And so I'm not saying that this is a possibility, but I am saying that it is a necessity. If you are going to construct machines that make ethical decisions, you're going to have to spend some time thinking about how the machine itself develops its own set of frenetic capabilities. Now, there's lots of different ways that can happen. Probably the best way is realizing that AI doesn't have its own character, like I said earlier, but it can reflect ours, it can mirror ours. And so you're going to want to make sure that the machine has access to standards and stories and various ways of being in the world that have proven to be effective in whatever culture you're releasing this particular machine into. And so for me, that would be a way for a machine to access human phronesis in a way that can allow it to make actionable decisions on its own. this is not an easy technology. It's not something that you can just bolt on. It's going to take work, and that's part of the work that I'm involved in. Just trying to, I and others are just trying to discover what it takes. What are the limitations of machines? What are their strengths? And I've been working with roboticist Antonio Cella in Palermo on thinking through healthcare robots that can help increase the frenetic judgments of the caregivers, and we'll see, right? It's a empirical question. Maybe that will work, maybe it won't, but we'll learn something about how machines influence or either extend or detract from the practical, pragmatic judgment that's required in ethical decision. That's what phronesis means. I probably should have defined that for the people that don't know that term, but it's usually in English we say practical wisdom, right? The wisdom to make good choices given what's in front of you.
Others on the panel want to address that question?
But it's just, I'm thinking about that, and I think of, so the most contentious when we're doing, when we developed our AI ethics principles, I ran the working group. I gave us 6 weeks. It took us the better part of a year, and we argued about every single word. And no words were argued about more than in our responsible principle. We said that AI-driven outcomes must be, one, you have to be notified that there's an AI-driven outcome, and two, you have to give someone a form of redress.
Right.
And we had people who said, kind of on the table, said, you're giving them a get out of jail free card. It's like literally that might be the case, but it says no. And part of it is auditability of conventional technologies. And when you talked about, I think of the language model, and I think it is that. It's the model. It is the model of which word should come next. Given the prompt, given everything that I have digested, what is the most likely word to come next, and then next, and then next. And so it is, the ability of that, relying on that kind of a system to come up with a recommendation of a behavior. You're only regurgitating some model of past, which is great if we agreed on the source material and we were very careful and we didn't let anyone inject any false signal and all this if.
Right.
And so that's when we end up with something that's unauditable, as opposed to here is a assessment of situations I'm transparently, and here you can look at all the code, all the ifs, all the thens, all the elses. We can run through it conventional. Perhaps no, but we're at the point now where AI is giving us ability to calculate and reason over a volume of information that is so much greater than the past. If we can do that transparently, but then again, that's only an aid to decision. It is not a decision system. It is an understanding system. So I think if we can go in with that understanding that these are only going to produce that which could be combined from past data fed in, or here's this audible system, but now I have a scale and an ability to understand and reason over information that's so much greater because the efficiency of these results, both those call for transparency, and then that's why we had to include that last line in our responsible prison, open up to form of redress, because, and again, that's what forms our research agenda, is to figure out, well, what could be done there. But when we're talking about that, it kept striking to me that that this is the challenge we have, is we're assuming a decision process when we're actually looking at a model of our past behavior. So the decisions were made perhaps hundreds or thousands of years ago, and now we're just seeing that reflected forward. Is that still valid? We're only 40 centuries away from humanity is in the literal center of the universe. Right. Turned out that wasn't too true. But we're saying, we've quoted Aristotle already today, he's what he told us that all the rocks fall down to the center of the universe, which is the middle of the earth, because that is their natural behavior. So probably should think about that whole import of not just the natural sciences and the philosophy, but what is being reflected forward.
And what's really interesting is Aristotle, of course, wrote not just on philosophy, but on everything, right? All sciences, political science. If Aristotle were to come today to Santa Clara University, one of my mentors often gives this example, and I think it's apt. If he went to each department would say, yeah, "That's old, that's garbage. What you believe, we've long since moved beyond it." When he shows up at the philosophy department and talks about virtue ethics, they go, "You're hired with tenure."
Claudia or Christopher? All right. The next question, I think, is kind of a core question on this subject. We speak as if we must rely on these systems. And so this, of course, involves a lot of risk for us to be taking this path forward. Are we stuck with what we're doing right now, or is there an alternative or alternatives?
Well, I'll speak from the enterprise. We are at this point where rapidly you will either be an enterprise whose decisions are driven in real time from every bite you can pull from everywhere. And the real question on being successful is how much information can I admit to reason? How can I get to those deepest insights in as fast a time as possible? And finally, then how do I turn those insights into action at scale? And that is a data-driven enterprise, and whether you're for-profit or public sector, whether you're science, arts, engineering, these are pervasive technologies. And soon we will get to the point where you'll be driving into these, or you'll be wondering, how did they do it? And if it is your responsibility to be competitive, and that's not just for enterprise, that is competitive in the realm of ideas and advocacy, then these are the technologies that you will be up against. So you can wish that we had a Butlerian jihad and we tore down all the computers and we no longer fashioned machines in the likeness of the mind of men, but that is not where we are. We are at a pervasive use of these technologies. And that's why pervasive understanding of the ramifications of utilizing the technologies is so important, not just for, we mentioned the designers, we mentioned the shareholders, but I think for all of us to be informed citizens in a society like the one that is being crafted around us, then there is a level of competency and understanding that we owe our fellow citizens in achieving.
Yeah.
Mr. Moderator, may I clarify? That was my question.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of recommender systems such as parole recommendations, job applications, insurance, and so forth. My suggestion to people is don't use them. Just don't use them. Just say no.
Mm-hmm.
So have we passed the point where that's actually possible, feasible, acceptable? I guess I'm a demand side ethicist.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first groups that came to us, our most voracious consumer of AI technologies in our company, human resources and marketing. And the HR team, they came and said, what we want to do, we want to take everyone from the new college graduate to the most senior technologists in the company, and we want at every point in their career arc to understand what do you want to do next with your career? How do we provide you the training, the experience, the mentorship? How do we recommend that next step for you that's authentic to what you desire to do with your career? And then the tool teams come in and they say, here we are, here's what we're going to do, we're going to set this up. So it's very attractive to someone who wants, in human resources, who wants to cultivate an individual's ability to take ownership of their career. And here's this tool. Now, the flip side is that we started having the conversations with our AI ethics principles. Okay, well, let's talk about your data integrity background. Let's talk about measuring bias, all these things. And to be frank, they didn't all have great answers. And so we've actually held back. But the possible benefits of utilizing the tool as opposed to the traditional way, well, I'm going to hire someone who went to the same school that I did. Of course, if it's Santa Clara University, then that's a perfectly justifiable choice. But that question, otherwise you end up perpetuating these hidden biases, these hidden mechanisms, and at least when we have this tool that's out there, we have that ability to inspect and to ask. In some cases, it's replacing a system that was never documented, that was always sort of institutional knowledge, which can be problematic if the institution has not fully examined its systems before. So I think that we will find these systems, they can be incredibly effective. They are very attractive to people who have the best intentions. I think from us, it's been taking that next step to describe those and then ask hard questions to the person who's trying to sell you exactly what you want.
I would be hesitant myself to sort of jettison the human agency or even the organizational agency. I think there's a good reason to be maybe skeptical of how fast or how easy that would be. But I think one example we've seen with sort of facial recognition technologies, certain companies have just opted out of using them unless under very, very constrained and specific contexts. Of course, I think part of that has to be what was mentioned, the sort of public engagement and public concern over these issues. But it seems like we have something to fall back on, or some examples to fall back on, and some history to fall back on design decisions or whether or not to develop a technology at all that have been taken and avoided. So I would be wary of sort of what we call technological determinism, that once we let it go, it's just going to keep on forever, and that think about how we have seen examples of human agency or organizational agency having an impact in this space and in the past, and sort of avenues to do it again.
You're John.
Yeah, I do have I agree a lot what Christopher said. I think the deployment of this system should be a political decision, and society as a role should participate a little bit more in those decisions. But I can see the force of how hard sometimes might be to avoid just kind of passive action, passive attitude, just to let those rely on those systems in a more general way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd add to Robin's really insightful question here is that, is there a point where we have to say no? As an individual, I think you definitely have that choice. The Amish do it in a very thoughtful way in their own community, and but here's what I would like to avoid is I'm thinking here of Heidegger, and Heidegger, of course, has this theory of technology, which is it's a being. It transforms being. It takes everything in front of it and changes it into something else. And your only option is you can't fight it, but you can maybe move to the Black Forest and live in a cabin and just wait for the machine to eventually grind you into dust. That may be the world we actually live in. I hope it is not the world we actually live in. I prefer to confront that machine long before it grinds up the Black Forest and see if there's some way that we can nudge it to one side or another. Is it possible? I don't know, but it's a heroic fight, and I think it's the only thing that the virtue of courage demands.
All right, we have run out of time, and I'm really going to apologize because I have all these wonderful questions here, and I could have asked I'd asked all of them if we had 3 more hours, but we don't. So thank you very much. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.